It started like any other day until it turned into a nightmare. Angela Carter, a hardworking black woman with a promising legal career, never imagined she'd find herself in handcuffs, accused of a crime she didn't commit. But when corrupt cops want someone to take the fall, truth doesn't matter. These officers, driven by prejudice and power, had one goal: silence her. And to make sure their plan worked, they pulled some strings behind closed doors, buying off a judge to guarantee Angela's conviction. As she sat in that courtroom, every eye was on her, some filled with judgment, others with quiet sympathy. The evidence was twisted, the witnesses rehearsed, and the outcome seemed certain. The cops smirked from the back of the room, already celebrating their victory. But just as the judge prepared to hand down his ruling, something changed. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The air grew heavy with confusion. And then, in an instant, the entire case flipped on its head. Because Angela Carter wasn't just another defendant. She was someone they never expected. And what happened next left the crooked cops and the judge they bought completely speechless. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge, who had been so confident moments ago, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The officers who had framed Angela stopped smirking. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, for them. Angela slowly lifted her head, her calm expression hiding the storm inside her. She had spent years working toward this moment, but even she hadn't expected it to happen like this. The prosecutor, who had been aggressively pushing the case against her, suddenly hesitated. The judge cleared his throat, flipping through the papers in front of him, as if searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Angela Carter wasn't just another defendant. She was the newly appointed district court judge, their new boss. The realization hit the corrupt cops like a ton of bricks. The very system they thought they controlled had just flipped against them. But Angela wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. And as she stared at the officers who had tried to destroy her, she knew this was bigger than just her case. This was about exposing the truth. But the real question was, how deep did this corruption go? And how many more people were involved? The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the courtroom. Angela could feel the tension thick in the air, but she stayed still, letting the truth settle in. The officers who had orchestrated this setup weren't just caught off guard. They were panicked. Their faces, once smug and full of certainty, had drained of color. The judge, the man they had paid to secure her downfall, looked like he wanted to disappear. Angela had spent her entire career fighting injustice, but now she was face to face with it in a way she never imagined. She knew these officers. She knew their history, their records, and the complaints that had been conveniently buried. They had gotten away with too much for too long. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, they had walked straight into their own trap. But Angela wasn't the only one in that room who had something to lose. The prosecutor, who had been pushing the case with unusual aggression, seemed to realize he had backed the wrong side. His voice wavered as he tried to regain control, but it was too late. The truth had cracked through the perfect plan they had built. Angela's mind raced. This went beyond her. If they had been willing to frame a sitting judge, how many others had they done this to? How many innocent people had been silenced, locked away, or worse? She glanced at the jury, at the people watching from the benches. Some of them were seeing the system for what it really was for the first time. Others had known all along. But Angela knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Every second that passed only tightened the noose around the corrupt officers and the judge they had bought. Angela could see it in their eyes, the desperation, the silent calculations, the frantic search for a way out. But there was none. They had walked into this thinking they controlled everything, but now the ground beneath them was crumbling. The prosecutor cleared his throat and tried to press forward as if nothing had changed. "Your Honor, if we could proceed." Angela stood. "That won't be necessary." Her voice was calm but firm, sending a ripple of unease through the courtroom. She turned to the officers. "Would you like to continue, or should I?" One of them, Officer Langley, shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. This is ridiculous," he muttered. Angela tilted her head slightly. "Is it? You framed an innocent woman, bribed a judge, and expected to walk away without consequence. But here's the problem. You picked the wrong woman." A hushed murmur spread through the spectators. The jury exchanged glances, some leaning forward, sensing the shift in power. The judge wiped his brow, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain control. "Let's not make accusations without proof," he said weakly. Angela turned, locking eyes with him. "You mean the same way this case was built on lies and planted evidence." She took a step forward. "Because unlike you, I actually have proof." The room tensed. The officers' breaths grew shallow. They hadn't just miscalculated. They had underestimated her entirely. Angela reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "You see, when people like you think you're untouchable, you get sloppy. You leave a trail. And lucky for me, I know exactly where to look." Langley stiffened. His partner, Officer Bradley, shot him a warning glance. They both knew whatever was in that folder could ruin them. Angela placed it on the desk in front of her, tapping it once. "Inside this are records, messages, and transactions linking all of you. Every bribe, every cover-up, every innocent life you've destroyed." Her voice remained steady, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. The judge clenched his jaw. "This is highly." Angela cut him off. "What's highly concerning is that you thought you could get away with this, that you thought no one would ever question it. But today, that changes." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The officers shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor looked pale. The judge's grip on his gavel tightened. Angela inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She wasn't just fighting for her own name. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by this corrupt system. And now they were all about to watch it come crashing down. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of Angela's words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The officers, the prosecutor, the judge, each of them trapped in their own silent panic. But then, just when it seemed like the walls were finally closing in on them, something shifted. The judge sat up straighter, his expression tightening. "Enough of this," he said sharply. His voice, once shaky, now carried an edge of authority. Too much authority. Angela recognized that tone. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, something calculated. Before she could respond, the courtroom doors suddenly swung open. A man in a dark suit, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, strode in with measured confidence. His presence sent an immediate ripple through the room. Angela's stomach twisted. "Excuse me, Your Honor," the man announced, walking straight up to the bench. "I'm Special Agent Mark Caldwell with Internal Affairs. I need to speak with you, privately." The judge's eyes flickered with something unreadable before he nodded stiffly. "We'll take a brief recess." He slammed the gavel down before anyone could protest. Angela's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. She had been so focused on the officers and the judge that she hadn't considered the bigger picture. Corruption like this didn't start with a few bad cops. It spread, infecting everything. Langley and Bradley exchanged quick glances. They weren't nervous anymore. They looked reassured, as if they knew something she didn't. Angela felt a cold chill run through her. Before she could move, another officer approached her. "Judge Carter, you need to come with me," he said in a low voice. Angela straightened. "Am I under arrest?" The officer hesitated. "Not yet, but I'd advise you to cooperate." The room around her blurred slightly as realization set in. They had planned for this. They weren't just going to sit back and let her expose them. They were going to fight back. Angela glanced at the folder still sitting on the desk. The truth was right there. But the question now was, had she come prepared for how far they were willing to go to bury it? Angela took a slow, steady breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she wasn't going to break. Not now, not when she was this close to exposing everything. The officer led her toward a back hallway, away from the courtroom, away from the eyes of the jury and the spectators. She knew exactly what was happening. They were trying to isolate her, to silence her before she could reveal what was in that folder. But they had underestimated her one last time. As they turned the corner, another voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She turned to see Special Agent Mark Caldwell again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two federal agents, their badges on full display. The officer holding Angela's arm immediately let go, stepping back in hesitation. Caldwell's expression was unreadable, but then he did something unexpected. He turned to the officer and held out his hand. "Your badge, officer. Now." The hallway filled with silence. Angela's mind raced. Was this another trick? Another move by the people protecting the corruption? But then Caldwell pulled out a sealed document from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "Judge Carter, we've been investigating this case for months. We knew the system was rigged, but we didn't have proof, until now." Angela's breath caught in her throat. Caldwell nodded toward the courtroom. "Your evidence wasn't the only thing collected today. Every word spoken in that courtroom was recorded. Every reaction, every attempt to derail the case, it's all documented." He paused, looking her in the eye. "We have everything we need." Angela exhaled slowly, realization dawning. They had walked into their own trap. Back inside the courtroom, the tension reached its breaking point. The judge sat rigid in his seat as Caldwell and his agents walked back in. Langley and Bradley shifted uncomfortably, their confidence now replaced with growing fear. Caldwell didn't waste time. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "this court proceeding is over. As of this moment, you, along with officers Langley and Bradley, are under federal investigation for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and multiple counts of corruption." The judge's gavel trembled in his hand. "This is outrageous." Angela stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "No, Your Honor. This is justice." Chaos erupted. The officers protested, the prosecutor paled, and the judge stammered, searching for an escape. But there was none. Then, just as security stepped forward to make the arrests, Caldwell leaned toward Angela and lowered his voice. "There's one more thing you should know." Angela turned, her pulse quickening. "This case, it only scratches the surface." Caldwell's gaze darkened. "There's someone bigger pulling the strings, and they know you're coming for them." Angela held his stare, her mind already racing ahead. The battle she just won was only the beginning. Angela stood in the middle of the courtroom, watching as the officers and the corrupt judge were led away in handcuffs. The weight of everything that had happened pressed against her, but she didn't let it show. Justice had finally been served, but Caldwell's words lingered in her mind. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. As the jury and spectators slowly left, whispers filled the air. Some looked at Angela with admiration, others with quiet relief. People had seen the truth today, and there was no going back. The system wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a step in the right direction. Caldwell walked up beside her. "You did good today," he said. Angela let out a slow breath. "So did you." He gave her a small nod before glancing toward the empty judge's bench. "Be careful. Whoever's at the top, they won't go down without a fight." Angela met his gaze, determination in her eyes. "Neither will I." As she walked out of the courtroom, the sun hit her face, warm and steady. She wasn't just a victim of the system. She was here to change it. And this was only the beginning.